Hi, Jan. Welcome to Walk the Talk. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you here. I'm sure our listeners, readers, or viewers are going to gain so much from you. I know for sure that I am going to. Now, let's get started with introducing you. For everyone who's listening, Jan is a legend on her own. She's a force to reckon with, especially in the sphere of workplace strategy. With a formal education in interior design and business administration, her career and work reflect the confluence of the left side of the brain with the right. That is, business and analysis with human centric design and thinking. She's one of those industry stalwarts who have worked with design and architectural leader Allsteel for over 18 years. She's devoted herself and her team to the study and support of workplaces that are human centric. In her current role as the principal at Workplace Collective, she continues to share her rich insights about what it takes to design and nurture a robust and effective workplace. Thank you so much, Jan. And there's so much that we want to ask you. For starters, how are you and what are you doing right now?
Well, I so appreciate this opportunity because I really am passionate about this topic, and it's just an honor to be able to do this with you. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion we're going to have, and I'm really pleased that we get a chance to talk about this topic together. So thank you
Yes,
for that.
for everyone to know, we have had multiple discussions with Jan, and every single time it's been amazing. I've always gone back with something actionable, a very important insight, and I'm sure that this is going to be a similar session. Without wasting much time, because there's so much that we want to ask you, I'll directly delve into the first question, which is that you started your career as an interior designer, and then eventually you became a strategic planner and a workplace consultant. What spurred that shift? And I want you to answer from the lens of the post COVID era, because there's so much changing, and workplace design has gone beyond aesthetics and just moved towards more human centricity. So,
Mhm,
how
mhm.
has the journey been? How has the shift been?
Well, I think the current time we're in is really reflective of frankly the last several decades in a sense, because I think we were coming at this sort of from a pure design perspective for a long time, and what was part of my journey was realizing that I was maybe, frankly, a rather mediocre designer, but an excellent consultant. And I was way more interested in the why than the what, because it seemed to me that the more we understood about our clients and the things they were grappling with and the directions they were trying to take and their culture and the way in which they did their work, the better we could do it at making sure we were delivering something that was going to be relevant to them. So I got lucky in a lot of ways in my career. And one of them was that my mentor at Perkins and Will, Neil Frankel, created a position that didn't exist before to get after that sort of data, to spend time talking directly to clients about where they were trying to take their business and the sorts of challenges they were having and the things they hoped that the workplace could do as they began to revisit it. And my job was to begin to understand that from a business perspective as best I could, and begin to to be able to translate that into the sorts of things that the design team could then run with. That there was a marriage between deeply understanding the client and what it is we could contribute as designers and as workplace strategists, even though it wasn't called that at that point in time. So, I think a lot has been written right now about the pandemic and all the things that it accelerated. But I think one of the things that we also have to realize is that all of that was sort of a giant experiment, as a lot of people have said. And I think part of the reason that productivity stayed high was in part because we were all in crisis mode. It's easy to sort of rally around the flag, to use that American expression, when there's some, thing we have to do that for. But that's not a sustainable approach. So how do we sort of sit in this middle ground now of not exactly knowing what lessons to take from that, how exactly knowing exactly how hybrid work is going to work, given that every organization is probably going to look at it a bit differently and probably should look at it a bit differently. Big believer in not one size fits all. And I think there's an opportunity for us to really consider what this disruption has done to accelerate all the things that we sort of wanted to do anyway. So all this social change around how people now, workers have new expectations about what they want from their employment and from each other in that experience, are really valuable and are pushing forward this sort of much more human-centric approach that we've been really needing for decades. For a long time, we sort of separated, you left your emotions at home and you sort of acted a bit drone-like at the office. And that has to stop because that's not realistic, nor is it helpful. People work better when they are engaged, when they're feeling the support of their leadership, when they understand the purpose and meaning of their work, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this and all the science that we have behind it is out there. We just need to learn how to harness it. And I think that's the biggest challenge we have right now.
Interesting. I do remember once, in one of our last conversations, you had mentioned that, it is not the accumulation of knowledge that really defines change, but it's actually the knowledge of the possible choices that we
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's going to be a very critical factor in driving the change, the way workplaces are evolving. But one of my questions still remains on that front is that what if people who are making these decisions feel that these are two very different and tangentially different choices to make? And I'll delve deeper into it. Very often, workplace efficiency and empathy are seen as two ends of the spectrum, right? One that is hard coded in business and profitability,
Mhm.
scale, etc. And the other
Mhm.
side is people, productivity, motivation. What are your thoughts on it? Are these two sides of the spectrum, or are these two sides of the same coin? And how do they work together?
Yeah. So to some extent, I want to kind of go in two directions in answering your question. Is one, I think there are actually four topics we need to talk about that are all really relevant to a robust workplace strategy. So I use the word efficiency, and my word for what you were talking about in terms of empathy is effectiveness. How do we make sure the workers can do their absolute best work? So those are sort of on a spectrum, absolutely. But there's another sort of axis, and I can bring up a diagram to show you what I mean. That basically is sort of juxtaposing these four topics. And so the vertical axis is this notion of really understanding sort of the bigger context of the organization and understanding what the organization is trying to do. And so I kind of alluded to this earlier around business objectives and culture and their social norms and all that sort of thing. We have got to understand that so that we don't do something that's going to be countercultural and therefore is not going to succeed. On the other end of the spectrum, under adaptability, we have to also not see this as being sort of set in amber and it's good until we have another lease expire and have to do something over. We have to keep up with the speed of business. And the workforce itself has the greatest insight into what it is that needs to continue to change because they're the ones doing the work each day. So this notion of them understanding the system that we're creating and thinking about it that way, that we're actually designing an ecosystem that can have puts and takes and constantly be evolving. The physical adaptability has to be there as well. We have to be able to make adjustments because we probably aren't going to get it right the first time, especially now with all this uncertainty about what the world really needs. And so it's to me, these are four super important ideas that all matter, that all have to be a consideration set. But I want to come back to what you were saying about, the conversations we've had in the past about having more options. And I'll admit, at the risk of oversharing, I've been in therapy a couple of times, and one of the biggest ahas for me in that universe of care was, oh, I now understand my part in certain patterns and the fact that I tend to choose to react the same way given a certain set of situations. And if I want to do something differently, I have to very, very deliberately and intentionally make a different choice. Once I understand what my options are to make those choices, I have to pick one and go with it. And so I thought for the longest time that if I at least understood my own, dynamic and motivation, that intellectual understanding would be enough. It's not. That's not what drives new behavior. It's actually taking the action to do something differently is the thing that's going to make the difference. And so we can all understand what the science is telling us about what helps people be their most successful. But if we don't take the action to actually incorporate it, especially under effectiveness, into the ways in which we engage people, the ways in which we design spaces, the ways in which we give them the ability to mess with stuff and adapt it to their needs and evolve it to make sense for them. We're missing an amazing opportunity for them to be not only making it better, but frankly, giving us better data and feeling way more engaged and involved and responsible and, feeling like they're doing something meaningful in the process. So I'm going to probably come back to this 3 or 4 times because I think it's the holy grail. Is this notion of engagement is really critically important. I want to also say that I want to tell a quick story, if you let me, and that is that I learned something that I didn't know I needed to learn when I was a consultant at Sun Microsystems several years ago. I've told this story. Some of you in the audience that are listening to this probably have heard me tell the story because I use it a lot, but I'll tell it again. And that is that early in my tenure as a consultant to Sun Microsystems, they came to me and said they had this intranet. And on the intranet, any employee of Sun Microsystems could order furniture for their private office.
Wow.
And my reaction was, what? You let them do what? We have to put a stop to that immediately. That's ridiculous. That's chaos. What are you doing? And they said, oh, no, if that's your reaction, you don't get it. I said, well, you please explain, because I'd like to get it, but that sounds really not like a good idea. Are you sure? And they said, oh, no, let's explain. First of all, you may not have understood what we said. We didn't say the internet. We didn't say it was anything under the sun that they felt like going and grabbing. We said it was our own intranet, and on that were 6 items that are already part of what we typically put in a private office. So these are not like extraordinary things. There's only 6 of them. Secondly, there's a check and balance system. Joe's boss sees at the end of every month, it was analog at that point and not digital, what Joe ordered. So if Joe's on his 15th desk chair and is secretly selling them on eBay, and it takes us a couple of weeks to catch on, we will, and we'll go find Joe and have a little chat. Third, we believe in a sociological principle called 95-5, which says 95% of the population tends to try to do the right thing. It's only 5%, not 50, like we may all believe, 5% that tend to be the ones that are going to perhaps game it and abuse this privilege. And so we did the math. If 5% of our population does indeed, do surreptitious things for a while before we catch on, we figure that costs us this much. And if we hire the 3 furniture police that we can see gleaming in your eye to fix this problem, that costs us this much. And it sends a message to our employees that you're children and we don't trust you, and we are not interested in sending that message. And finally, the last point is these are not high ticket items in the larger scheme of things. If these employees, because they feel loved and supported and can get what they need to get their jobs done in a timely fashion, that lateral file will pay for itself in about a week. So back off. Well, I tell you, that blew my mind. It was this life-changing aha of, oh, I thought my job was gatekeeper. No, not at all. My job is systems designer. How do I create the opportunity for people to get what they need to do their work? And let's assume that most, 95% of the population is trustworthy, rather than assuming 95% of the population is not and is going to take advantage of us, because that's not how the world actually does work, despite all the things we hear about in the news.
Yeah.
So right after that, I had a chance too then to get to Nortel and to do some work for them to design a global strategy. And that's where this 4-pronged approach really came to light. Is as we began to talk about the things they wanted to do as an organization, it was clear that we needed a model like this to clarify for their leadership and for the teams we were going to be spending time with, and for the people we were going to be presenting to in town hall meetings, that we were just as concerned about each of these 4 things as any one of them. Because when it was initially first discussed within Nortel, everybody only heard the efficiency thing, because the real estate team had stuck up its hand and said, we're going to cut our real estate usage in half. And so everybody else heard that as a giant takeaway. And our job was to say, whoa. Yes, that's one of the 4 things we're going to absolutely try to do. But there's these other 3 things that I think you'll be, feel much more comfortable about and much more peaceful about, that we have just as high a priority around these 3 things as we do around space utilization. So work with us. We have all the best intentions. It's a really robust strategy. We're going to try to help you understand how to translate your work processes into space more clearly, because they were kind of hierarchy based at that point, et cetera, et cetera. So I won't go into too much more detail, but it was a real opportunity to develop a model that I think let us tell the messages to a whole host of folks and let them hear what they wanted to hear, in a sense, because everybody sort of got their needs met.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing how simple things across these four tangents can really make a big difference. And I think I can keep listening to your stories because these are so insightful. You have mentioned two of your clients over here, but there's so much more that you have done in past, and I would definitely want to touch base on the knowledge worker productivity aspect, the work that you have done over there, and I just want to ask you, what are the three big, I mean, I know it's too much to ask, but still, I want to know what are the three big shifts that you feel have happened post COVID in the last 3 years, right?
Well,
And
yeah.
how has the pandemic changed the needs in terms of the workspaces?
Well, I think let me answer the second part first, because I want to come back to the human side again, and talk about it in a little more depth. But I think the spatial thing is, we know that we probably need a lot less space than we've been using. And we've known that actually before the pandemic, because, many design organizations did, bed checks or used a tool like yours to understand what utilization and occupancy looked like. And we know that occupancy was averaging about 45%, maybe. So this is not a new problem that we're all dealing with right now. And to some extent, we had this problem before the pandemic started, but I think it's clearly much more obvious now, as people are staying at home intentionally, from time to time, some period of time in a given week. And the hybrid thing is becoming a thing that we really have to sort of solve for. But I think the bigger notion that I'm actually really excited about, and I mentioned this earlier about what the pandemic has wrought, is I think it really has shined a huge spotlight on the human aspect of things. And people's expectations, workers' expectations having shifted is a huge manifestation of that, right? But I think we've known about the science for a long time. We sponsored this research several years ago, and the researchers basically combed databases of studies that had already been done with good scientific rigor, and shared with us the top 6 factors that are tied to team productivity. The first is social cohesion amongst the team. The second is perceived supervisory support, the idea that my boss has my back. The third is information sharing flows well, something called transactive memory systems, if you're geeky like I am. The fourth is goal clarity. The fifth is this idea of keeping open-minded about your mental models and taking in external input and watching competitors and paying attention to the news and doing all sorts of other things so that you can constantly shift your thinking and be open-minded to see things differently, because that is how innovation happens. And the sixth was trust. None of those things have anything to do with space.
Yeah.
So all the stuff that's the really juicy stuff that helps us really understand effectiveness, to use this model, is tied to, interpersonal relationships. And so the next thing I wanted to show you here is a slide that shares some of that information. And what you're seeing that I just talked about is this list up here. So this is an eye chart, and I apologize for how much information is on it. But we took it a step further once we sponsored the original studies that gave us these 6 top things, but then also was able to work with Sally Augustin, who's an environmental psychologist, to sort of fill in the rest of the chart and say, this is what the science is telling us these days. This is all the information that we know that's been studied with great rigor, and we know these things matter. So let's not set these things aside and not take advantage of the fact that we've got all the science. I have a good friend, Jeff Leitner, brilliant guy. He's a social scientist, among other things. And one of the things that he was explaining to me a couple of years ago was that science is usually about 15 years behind in terms of common day-to-day understanding of it. In other words, something gets discovered in 2000 and it takes until 2015 for the rest of the world to catch on, right? 15 years is that's criminal that we don't take advantage of it and apply it any sooner than that. So we're trying to basically make sure that the world knows about these things, and I'm trying to spend the rest of my career getting these things into the hands of the folks that are going to make decisions around, workplaces, to make sure that we really understand how important these things are and how much upside they have. Getting these team things right are the things that correlate most highly to effectiveness. So why wouldn't we shoot for those kinds of things and make sure we're doing those really well, and not so much worry about cutting our real estate costs? So again, efficiency is fantastic, but effectiveness, much greater upside. I think then too, the next thought is that we have to figure out how to expand, this sort of face-to-face interaction. We relied, without even realizing we were doing it, on the office for all this time, assuming that everybody was going to be in and we would have all this face time together. That's still the case, but we now have to also solve for how we create social cohesion in hybrid environments when we don't see each other face to face, when we're not in each other's presence, and we aren't, talking over lunch someday or sitting over a cup of coffee together. We've got to learn new skills around how to do these things more effectively. And of course, I can look at my grandchildren who, have friends across the world they've never met and consider those friends really close relationships. So it's certainly possible, but I think there's a whole kind of vocabulary of how we do this much more intentionally and purposefully. So I think we've got to try new ways of interacting that build those connections and build trust and build understanding, build, understanding of who knows what to take advantage of each other just that much more effectively. And I think the third piece is engagement. I've sort of alluded to this already too, is this idea of involving workers in the process of understanding how they work, what they're doing, what their most critical processes are, how they think the team itself in the aggregate is going to work well. When do they need to be face-to-face? When don't they need? How are they going to share information? How do they make themselves available to each other? My mentor at Sun was a big believer, even 20 years ago, in encouraging teams to work it out for themselves and to discuss those things, to negotiate how they were going to behave towards each other and the ways in which they did intend to work. And I think that's ever more relevant now, because we've got to all be much more intentional and thoughtful about how we're doing things. And the process of listening in on those discussions have a tremendous amount of benefits. One, we get better data as designers. Two, the team becomes much more self-aware around how it's working and what it needs to do it. It also, by us talking to them about what we intend to do with the information they begin to share with us about the way they work, it sets expectations about what the process of getting from what they're doing to the way the space is going to support it is going to be much clearer to them. So they begin to trust the process and are probably more encouraged to give us good data. I think it sets, again, that negotiation amongst the team about how they get their most critical work done, and therefore it builds team awareness. I think it's absolutely a much more helpful form of change management, because these people are actually coming along on the journey with us. And finally, if their manager is also privy to this whole process, it's building trust, because that person sees that this team is taking this seriously, that they're giving it a lot of thought, that they're being very intentional about what they do, that they really have, their own success at heart and is being, is part of their motivation. And the manager can then take a breath because they don't have to micromanage the team. The team is doing that for themselves, and the process is going to be much more robust and thoughtful. And the team now has more ownership over what they do and can continue to adapt over time if they discover some things they thought would work didn't work, right? It's again back to sort of virtuous cycle of them being the ones that are really empowered to continue to make it better for themselves.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing is the in terms of the three big shifts, and let me just summarize what maybe I learned, and correct me if I'm wrong. First is that the business community is now talking a great deal more about human centricity. Mm-hmm. Second is the ways we act on this knowledge has to expand to non-face-to-face interactions, right? And the third is that we need to double play in need assessment for both functional and behavioral aspects as a powerful way to make them feel heard, seen, and felt, right? So
Yeah.
that's the take back. Very interesting. So what I see is that there is a way to channel the energies of the diverse workforce. Now that workforce could be remote, in office,
Mhm.
workforce could be new or very seasoned, or maybe from, keeping in mind the DEI aspects of it. There is a role, but what role can design play in elevating the team dynamics? For instance, the layout, the ergonomics, the
Mhm.
aesthetics in a workplace. How can that help motivate the team and maybe help them to collaborate more productively? What are your thoughts here?
Yeah. No, I think to some extent, what I was alluding to is that in sense that the design process of engaging people, at leadership to enroll them in the idea of those four goals of alignment, effectiveness, efficiency, and agility or adaptability, is a way of starting to educate them and bring them along and have them understand the breadth and scope and the power of what workplace strategy can do. So there's a process up front to enroll them in the process and make a commitment to give us access and resources and understand what it is we need from them to deeply understand them so we can do the best job for them. I think the design process then starts into the needs analysis piece I was saying earlier. And now by bringing along as many people as they will let us talk to, we're creating informed consumers. We're creating people who aren't having things done to them, they're having things done with them, and they're in their best interests because that's what they're sharing with us. And why would we mess with that? Like, why wouldn't I want to do exactly what that team needs to have done for them to make them the most effective?
Yeah,
And by explaining the whole way in which this is getting sort of again translated into space and provisioning, they now get it. I mean,
yeah,
it's I've worked with a number of teams recently and just laying out the process and asking them the questions we ask about the nature of the ways they work, they begin to see immediately what it is we're going to do with that information. And they see the link between what they need to do and what they get to do it with.
yeah,
And so they become, like I said, informed consumers who can then continue to tell us if something needs to shift that they can't do themselves, although I'm a big believer in DIY, and the things that they can do themselves that they should do themselves. Why would we want to stop that? I
yeah.
remember when I was walking through a hallway in Nortel's Ottawa campus several years ago with my client, and this woman comes rushing up to us and she says, David, you have to come see our new space. We completely rearranged, the space that you originally gave us. Now, most facilities people or workplace people would start to twitch, right? Like, what? You did what? Kind of like my son's story, right? That was not David's reaction. It was a thing of beauty. He said, "Oh my God, that's fantastic. Please take us there now. I can't wait to see what you come up with because clearly you're in the middle of it all. You know what it is you need to do. If you figured out some better way for us to have made your space, your neighborhood work for you, I'm all in because then I want to share it with other teams like yours because they can probably learn from the things that you figured out." Exactly, right? Isn't that exactly what any organization should want to have happen instead of freaking out about it? So I think this notion that we really want to harness the interest and the self-motivation and the sense of being able to be purposeful and do something meaningful. Why wouldn't we want to harness all the energy that employees have to really be masters of their own fate to an extent, as long as it's satisfying this larger thing that the organization is trying to accomplish? But why wouldn't we want to harness all that energy and commitment and interest and positivity? It's
So you're saying that organizational priorities should be engagement, yes, but they should only work on the why and not the how, and let employees maybe uh, you know lead the how of it, and
well,
maybe
I
be a very
lead may
strong.
be a strong word. I think we're sort of facilitating that process.
So
I
need
think it's a
we need to be key
facilitation process.
stakeholders in defining how engagement should
Yeah,
be happening, right?
yeah.
Very interesting. See, I was myself an employee before I started Veris, and I was working at beauty brands like the Body Shop and Avon, and I remember that from a design work perspective, the water cooler was something that was critical. Those chats are very important, and that was a very important aspect of our work lives. uh, COVID has changed a lot, and I think companies are still struggling to find a way to replicate that in the post-COVID hybrid era. uh, have you seen any such implementations that have really, you know, uh, found the answer to that? Or what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think it's almost too soon. I think that certainly there are organizations that are experimenting, and it's funny. I was talking to a designer out in Seattle several months ago, and he was saying that some of his most conservative clients are the ones that are actually doing the most experimentation, which was
Wow.
interesting, and good to hear. But I think part of it is back to what we were talking about a minute ago of letting the teams really get very conscious and intentional about their own processes. But I also think that it's interesting to see, and I'm just going to sort of digress for a second. Brian Berthold with Cushman and Wakefield is in charge of doing. I can't even really best. I should let him describe his job, but he does some really interesting stuff around what he calls work experience per square foot or something like that. And the notion is that he's really after the data that can be mined from understanding people's reactions to their space. And I'm really oversimplifying it. But one of the things that he's got out on LinkedIn these days is a discussion around how FaceTime, when women do go to the office, seems to boost their well-being by being in person with each other more than it does for men. And his question to his LinkedIn community is, why would that be the case? And Kay Sargent and others weighed in on it and had some views about, the pressures on women around childcare and caregiving in general and that sort of thing. But I also think that it's this notion of affiliation, right? Is when we're around other people that we already trust and have good relationships with, and we get a dose of the positivity of that social cohesion we've already built with those people, we come away feeling energized again.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure really, I can't answer the question about why that is more impactful for women than it is for men. Because then I probably would fall back on some stereotypical tropes that I'm not going to go near. But it just makes me wonder, what is that? And I don't know if it's just that we're more interested in the nature of those relationships. I'm not sure. I don't want to again make broad sweeping generalizations. But it just seems to me that was a really interesting statistic that Brian raised. And it's a good question to get after is, why do women seem to get more out
I don't
of?
know. Again, I also don't want to fall into the pit of, generalizing. But if I were to answer for myself, I feel men compartmentalize better, which is why it is easier for them to work from both spaces wherever they are. But as a female, and I speak more for myself as I have a 3-year-old, if I'm at home, I would be constantly worried whether he's eaten, whether he's not, if he's weeping, if he's cared for. While when I'm at work, I'm able to cut off and focus and maybe be more productive. Now, that's an answer that's just coming from my own self. I don't know
Sure.
if it is the answer for the larger lot.
Yeah.
And I do not want to generalize here.
It's a tough one because it's easy to go there, but let's not. But I think the other part is we also have to be careful about not being too cavalier about creating those social spaces in the office. I mean, we certainly have been doing that for a long time, and we've really been switching from a very individual workstation or office centric floor plan to one that's a lot more around collaboration and social interaction and connection. And I think that's all to the good. But I also think that, we, the design community, have done sometimes some things that have not been in the organization's best interests. I will just use myself as a bit of a story here. And that when I was a young designer, you're looking at a two-dimensional floor plan. And if there was a space that just looked sort of like a void, we'd put a plant in it, like let's fill that corner with plants because we don't really know what else we should be doing with it. Right. And I think we've been to some extent guilty of that same sort of phenomenon when it comes to let's plop down 2 comfortable side chairs and assume that space will get used. Au contraire. if you're on a main circulation pattern and there's 1 million people going by, trust me, there will be no kind of intimate conversation happening in those 2 chairs. So we really got to be careful about understanding, again, what it is that supports conversation of various types and sizes, and where the best places are to put some of those spots so they don't create noise for other people, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm getting into the weeds, but I think there's a lot more thought that needs to be given into, instead of just sort of plopping them down and assuming that that's what we need to do. Again, I go back to engage to understand the dynamics of how the teams are actually moving through their space, using those spaces, frequency, duration, et cetera, to understand where we need acoustical support. All those sorts of things come into play. That has to be part of the discussion. And we have to get smarter about it, instead of just, maybe designing 8 different types of collaboration spaces that have lots of different variety and then letting people vote with their feet. That is not thoughtful. That's guessing.
Yeah.
And we have to knock it off.
So my notes say that in-person or virtual path crossing need to be much more intentional now in the post-COVID era. And the second is the physical spaces we designed to enable easy social connection should be more carefully planned to maximize their use, right?
Absolutely.
Very, very interesting take back over here. Now, now that we are talking about the post-COVID era and things are evolving every single day, and I still don't know where the future lies, despite the fact that we at Veris have been interacting with hundreds of companies, and we're seeing that every single company has a different take. They're not sure where it's heading. They don't know what they want to do with their return to work plans. Return to work is a word that people are not even using anymore because they feel people are back at work entirely. But that's not true. The patterns show that's not true. The employees are not back yet. They're still facing hurdles in terms of productivity and collaboration. So we don't know where the end is. And we're done with almost half of 2023. What, according to you, are the biggest trends that have emerged in your interactions with people? And what do you think is there to stay? What is just a passing phase? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think everybody would agree that hybrid is here to stay. Now, hybrid means pretty much different things to everybody differently, right? So there's no one pure definition and no one right answer. And I think this is maybe why there's a certain amount of analysis paralysis, because some organizations are holding out for, whatever Jamie Dimon decides to do or whatever Tim Cook decides to do, instead of understanding their own organization as thoroughly as they might to come up with what they think would work for them. And again, not one size fits all. So I think that it's here. We've got a lot of work to do inside each organization to figure out what that means to each organization. And, again, not to set it in stone so that it can't continue to evolve, because this is a giant experiment for all of us. We haven't done it on this kind of scale across multiple organizations before. So we're all experimenting to a certain degree, and we should understand that as such. Trust it to be something that will work out, but again, engagement to try to work through what it is that seems to work best. I think the second piece is I'm really pumped, and of course some of this is perhaps wishful thinking on my part, but I really hope that this whole shift around worker expectations doesn't get shot down. I'm really hoping we don't drift into recessions so that organizations do what they usually do, which is entrench and start, cutting costs rather than thinking about the human aspects of things. So I'm really hoping that all the science that we've uncovered and have been sharing broadly just continues to be absorbed and help to inform the sorts of choices organizations make and the way in which they understand what leadership looks like post-pandemic.
Very interesting. So I've tried to summarize the gist of our entire conversation, and I would like to know if you would like to add on over here. First, there's not one size fits all, and that's something that all organizations need to understand and not just blindly follow the trends of the biggies. The second is this entire thing is a big, giant experiment which is continuously evolving, still in the works. Nobody knows where it is heading, so we need to take maybe baby steps to try, test, evolve, question, judge, again, try, right?
Mhm.
Third is engagement to the power of infinity. That's something that is going to take us where we want to head as a company, because the workers are going to be happy, and we need to make them feel empowered in taking the decisions that the company is taking for them, right?
Yeah.
Fourth is worker expectations are something that everybody needs to consider if they want to reach a happy ending, so to say.
Mhm. Mhm.
And fourth is data-driven decisions are something that, fifth is data-driven decisions are something that companies and leadership need to, look at, specifically the data that is coming out of their employee expectations. Right.
I think
So
so.
yeah,
I
that
would add one thing is it may sound like I'm saying let them do whatever they want, let them eat cake. And that is not what I'm saying. I think again the parameters of efficiency, the parameters of alignment, all require that this is in the context of what the organization needs to accomplish. So what I am saying though is that we know that those employees who feel empowered, who have greater autonomy, who feel trusted, who feel respected, who feel motivated because of the way in which they're treated and engaged, are going to be, tremendously more successful than those organizations who micromanage. So it's been proven over and over again. Gartner is talking about this. Cornell did some research 10 years ago. Daniel Pink's book, Drive, written over 10 years ago, says the exact same thing. These are proven topics. I don't know how else to describe them, but we know these things are true. We know they matter. I think we could do a much better job of really sort of internalizing them and leading from a position of strength, knowing that those things matter.
yeah. I think that's where the alignment aspect comes in the right, and that's
Mhm.
very critical, and people probably should start there. So great interaction, Jan. There's so much to take back. I'm sure there are going to be questions pouring into you, and I hope you're going to help us every time there's a question that comes to
Absolutely.
you around this. Thank you so much for taking out the time.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been such a pleasure, and it's just been
Likewise,
delightful.
likewise. Thanks, John.
All right. Take care.